one of the lessons I think is just showing up for each other, right? I get every time I talk now, and I've been on tour for about 2 weeks, like, I get this Winston-Salem, North Carolina woman in the front row, in the Q&A, she goes, "Help! How do I get through Thanksgiving?" And I say, "First of all, like, do go. You don't have to stay
Yeah.
forever, but go. And, um, remember what it is. We're not just our politics. Remember who we are as people. Celebrate the things that you revere in your family, whether it's our feisty mom or who was hilarious and, playing guards, drinking beer, eating food, and fishing. I went fishing with my brother when we, have this
Yeah.
really difficult conversation, and now we're close again. So we got to keep throwing stuff on the wall and seeing what sticks.
Hello and welcome to Why Is This Happening? With me, your host, Chris Hayes. At this point, what are we, 10 years into unfortunately, the Trump era of American politics, which I think is what kind of you have to call it. There has been so much reporting, social science, punditry, discourse about the kind of realignment that's happened, whereby particularly white working class voters who once tended towards Democrats have moved towards the Trump era Republicans, particularly acute in post-industrial states, particularly acute in rural areas. You would think that there's nothing left to be said about this. It is very well-trod terrain. And so when I saw there was a new book by the really excellent journalist Beth Macy on this topic, my first thought was I feel like I've kind of read this before, but Macy's just an incredible reporter and a great writer. She wrote Dopesick. We had her on the podcast to talk about that book, which is a really remarkable book. And this latest book it's both memoir and reporting, and her unique ability to sort of move between those two modalities. She's a top flight reporter and a great writer. And she also grew up in a rural post-industrial county in Urbana, Ohio, in a poor household that was troubled in many ways and difficult, but she also had a great childhood in a lot of ways that she talks about in the book, and went back to her hometown to revisit it 40 years later, for both a project of reportage, but also to care for her dying mother and to reconnect with family and friends there. And the product of this, which is a memoir called Paper Girl, a memoir of home and family in a fractured America, is a truly excellent piece of work that, for all of the discourse that we have had on this subject, what has happened in rural America, small town America, post-industrial America, what has happened to it economically, what has happened to it in terms of its politics, its social fabric. This is one of the best, most subtle, textured accounts I've read it on, and really a pleasure to get to talk to Beth about her book. Here's our conversation. Beth Macy, welcome to Why Is This Happening?
Thanks for having me back, Chris.
You were back here. You were here for Dopesick, which is an incredible book, and it still lingers with me, our conversation about that and both that book. This book, your latest, really messed me up. It's a really, I mean, there's a lot of beautiful parts of it and inspiring parts, but it I don't know what about it. It's in some ways the terrain at the most abstract level is relatively familiar. We have a kind of discourse around what's happened to small town and rural and post-industrial America. But I think the personal nature of this and the texture of it just really, really affected me. It's an incredible piece of work.
Thank you so much. It was a painful book to write at times.
Part of the pain is that you are back in your hometown, Urbana, Ohio, in a place that's changed a lot, but a place you're still very connected to. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that, about your connection to it, because I think one of the kind of sorting mechanisms of modern life that exacerbates precisely the kind of gulf that you're illustrating is the people who stay and the people who go. And the people that go, then they go and they're away and they're physically removed from the people who stay, like those old evolutionary tales of the squirrels on either side of a big canyon that grows up, right? And they evolve differently. And the people that go are clustering in other places that aren't their hometown, and the people who stay are clustering in the hometown, and this gulf grows up between the two. And part of what I think is so affecting about this book is you did go away, but you do come back, and it feels like you're still connected there.
Yeah, I have a lot of friends. I was the paper girl in the town, and my family still lives either in Urbana or around there. And so I would go home, once or twice a year. I never missed a class reunion. Well, I missed the very last one. I had a work conflict, but I didn't miss it on purpose. And I have very fond memories of growing up there, and I've maintained my friendships with people I've known since I was 4 years old.
Tell me about your town and what it was like to grow up there.
Yeah, so it's about 11 to 12,000 people. When I was growing up in the 70s and 80s, it was largely dominated by one factory, which was called Grimes Manufacturing, and it was very kind of patriarchal, top down, but for the most part, old man Grimes ran it. Roughly but well. He, scholarships for top students, paid an almost living wage, employed, was the largest employer, but also did things like maneuver to keep an interstate from coming nearby because that would force a raise in wages. And so it was, as I was, I've now been gone for 40 years since I went to high school, since I graduated from high school. I was starting to notice just the changes, starting with the collapse of Grimes. I mean, it's still there. It's been sold many times, and now it's owned by an international conglomerate. And there is no old man Honeywell sort of looking out for the town or doing things like funding the hospital where I was born. There is still manufacturing in town, more than average for a town that size. But the big shocker that I kept bumping into was the fact that the manufacturers that are left can't get people to show up to work on time every day. So every single plant was hard up for labor, to the point of they were busing in Haitian immigrants from Springfield. If I asked one employer, I said, if you hired 10 people today, how many would still be here in 6 months? And he said, one, and we'd probably have an attendance issue with him.
And that speaks to what has changed in the place other than just kind of work going away. I mean, I was struck about, the Black sociologist William Julius Wilson and the idea of when work leaves. He did a study of sort of what happened to the south side of Chicago and other urban Black neighborhoods when that industrial base goes away. And it is so striking how similar the trajectory is of that story, which I think ends up being the kind of Black urban deindustrialization, ends up being that kind of canary in the coal mine for what would happen basically 30 or 40 years later to white rural workers in areas when the kind of manufacturing base goes away. You talk about the trajectory of your town from when you were there to what it is now.
Sure. So when I was there in the 70s and 80s, the schools were very strong. I went to college on a full Pell Grant, which means I didn't have to pay. I mean, back at the time, tuition was so low that I could go to a 4-year college without, I got tuition, room and board, work study jobs. They even bought my books. And today, the amount that a similarly poor student would get would just be 30%. So basically, we've taken college away, a 4-year college away from poor kids, with hardly anyone raising a fuss about it. And when I looked at the other changes, because I follow people and I love people's stories, but I got to do the spinach work too. So when you look at the data, you can see it. You can see the effect of the opioid crisis in, for instance, the number of emergency mental health calls. That's gone up by a factor of 9 since I left 40 years ago. Food stamps have doubled. Foster care has tripled just since 2015. And the graduation rate has gone down by 12 points. And because there is very little reporting, as there are in 91% of the counties which went for Trump, are considered news deserts, people don't even know what's happening. They might know what they see on Fox and what they see on Newsmax, but they don't know what's happening in their own backyard.
This story of decline, which you tell both in numbers and also in stories, and we'll get into some of the characters in the book. I mean, it's so overwhelming, and so it really seems pretty all encompassing. There's one detail that struck me so much as a detail about it, which is the school band and the
Oh,
enrollment in the school band and what they can spell out at
right. That was a
halftime
right.
of the football game.
Right. We're the Urbana Hill Climbers, and we could spell out the whole word hill climbers with an S on the end. And now they can only spell the word Ohio, OHIO, with the tuba player dotting the I. And that's using seventh and eighth graders. We didn't use seventh and eighth graders. So that was a really telling detail because, being in band costs money. You got to buy the instrument, you got to have somebody come and pick you up from practice after school if you can't get a ride. And it was just a real telling detail of a hollowed out middle class.
And when you lived there, you're very frank about your upbringing, which was sort of not middle class. It was basically kind of hanging on poor, I think, right? Working poor.
That's right.
And talk a little bit about the kind of the class structure of your town, where you sat in it, but how proximate and mobile that class structure was when you were there.
Yeah, I lived on a block of very modest houses, mostly factory workers, but right around the corner was our dentist, who turns out to be Woody Harrelson's uncle. I got to know Woody one summer. Really nice mansions started by the people that started the university that's now closed. And just a real sense of camaraderie. My neighbors left their doors unlocked, and now you walk down the block and, I was startled one day by a Ring camera and somebody yelling out, "You are being recorded." It's like everybody's pretty paranoid to the point of the young woman that lives in the house that I grew up in. I asked her what year she graduated, and she said, "Oh, I was homeschooled by her mom, who was a housekeeper at the college before it closed." And that was another thread that just blew me away. The number of people who are homeschooling and or enrolling their kids in an adjacent district, which has higher test scores. And so that when those kids open enroll elsewhere or homeschool, the money follows the kids. And a couple years ago, the conservative legislature in Ohio deregulated homeschool entirely, so that before it used to be that a former teacher, retired teacher, had to sign off on the lesson plans, and now it's just a simple one-pager. One parent handed the truancy officer a permission written on a Post-it note. And the unintended consequence of that is that if you're a parent, maybe you're definitely struggling with poverty, maybe you're struggling with addiction too, and you can't manage to get up in the morning to get your kids off to school, you can simply, to avoid truancy charges, you can say you're homeschooling and hand the truancy officer a Post-it note.
That is so wild. And you saw this up close there.
Absolutely. Every time I went home for about a week a month for 2 years, and I would always check in with kind of my 4 or 5 beacon people in the story, people that you meet them at the beginning and you sort of see them at the end, and I touch base with them all the way through. And one of them was the truancy officer, who was this astonishing woman, so dedicated
she's
to
amazing.
her job. Yeah. I mean, she got beat up a couple of times during my following her. She put 115,000 miles on her car in a couple of years, doing things like with her own money, incentivizing kids who actually improve their attendance by finding out what they loved and take them to the Comic-Con convention in Columbus, for instance, on her own dime. But they needed about 10 of her.
One thing that's really striking in the combination of memoir and reporting here is what the sort of continuities and discontinuities. So and I want to talk a little bit about addiction in that context, because in some ways your home life is largely impacted and structured by your father's alcoholism. And
absolutely.
And one of the things that I think is really interesting, and this emerges in, emerges in the fictionalized version in Demon Copperhead. It's present in J.D. Vance's book. It's present in much of the reporting I've read. it's not like substance abuse is new. Either in Urbana, Ohio, or anywhere really. I mean, I think every family, including my own, has tales of substance abuse and addiction that go back, and sometimes they're menacing, sometimes they're funny, sometimes they're kind of a combination of both. But what feels like it changes is the ability, the sort of structures and institutions around the addiction that can allow a kind of flourishing or at least functioning in
Right.
the presence of that addiction. And that in your example, that those institutions and that social network and that social capital was there to allow it, and now it's kind of gone, if that makes sense. Like, is that how, talk a little bit about that.
Well, yeah, I wasn't just raised. I had one stable parent. I had a grandma next door that taught me how to read when I was 4. So when I got to school, I was ahead of most of the kids, and that was like having my own private head start, right? I can't emphasize how important that was. But I also had, not just in my neighborhood, but among my friends' parents, um, a friend's mom who would make me lunch every single day of high school. Like, we would go home for lunch. She would make tuna salad one day, then chicken salad, then egg salad, then we go back to tuna. And her dad had been an alcoholic too, and she would just talk to me. And it was like my first counselor.
Hmm.
And other parents who would give me rides home from band practice and rides to school. And the community basically helped raise me. I think another difference worth pointing out between alcoholism, which, as you say, has been around forever, and opioids, which are more recent, is that when you're an alcoholic, you tend to live longer, as opposed to you're addicted to pills, heroin, or fentanyl, which you could die today, and people tend to die younger. So I had my dad until the age of
Yeah.
57, as opposed to Silas, the young man in the story, whose mother was in and out of prison on drug charges and whose father died of a methadone overdose related to COVID, in conjunction with COVID also. And, ends up with a caregiver who molested him for 3 years. And there wasn't, I mean, when I met him, he had just recently got into counseling. Now, he had counselors at the school who helped him. I don't know that he shared everything that was going on, but he had a lot of support in that the truancy officer would make sure when he was couch serving his junior and senior year that he could get from wherever he was staying, even outside the county, to the school that day. And he had a band director that would let him have lunch in the band room every day so they could plot out his moves. I mean, the guy's name is David M. Sapp, and Silas, the young man in the book, has him entered in his phone as David M. Dad, 2 Ds, 3 Ds, DADD. And so there are those great, like,
Yeah.
beacons and heroes in the story too, but it, much like Demon Copperhead, you're just like, man, kid, where did you get this resiliency and this sense of humor? I don't know if you remember when his car breaks down and he has to drop out, and he finally gets a decent car, and he says, I don't know, Beth, that car is more bipolar than I am. It's just like, we were sharing a stage at Urbana where I did an event, my first book event, a couple of weeks back. And I said, Silas, how did you get so daggone resilient? And he said, well, I didn't have a reliable family, so I created my own. And I think that's really it. I think it's not about test scores and grades. I think it's about these relationships that got him over all these humps. And they were relationships with teachers and counselors and David M. Dad and so many people who helped get him across the finish line.
Yeah, Silas is an amazing, well, he's not, I was going to say character, but he's a real person, an amazing person,
Yeah.
as reflected in your book. And he's a trans man who comes from, very intense addiction and dysfunction and some abuse. Obviously very bright, very charismatic, incredibly resilient. And you talk about the difference between, a lot of the book ends up really being about education, in a really central way. And the
Mm-hmm.
difference between what was available to you in terms of education and money and what's available to him, and how that's in some ways the kind of short version of the story of what's happened in the last 40 years.
Exactly. My editor kept pushing that. I would come back and I'd send him these. I mean, I can't believe I sent him all this, but I would send him 8-page single-spaced documents, summaries of my interviews. And I went into the project. I mean, we call it Paper Girl because I wrote for newspapers for years and I slung newspapers literally, as a kid. In order to afford my out-of-state field trip to Washington, D.C., because my parents couldn't pay for it. And I thought it would be mainly about the decline of media, and that's a piece of it. But what the reporting kept underscoring was not only are we not sending kids to Silas to 4-year schools, which he could have totally handled. He has the chops for it. We weren't even helping them graduate from high school anymore. So the very first person I interviewed who actually introduced me to Silas, she is the counselor at the school that helps kids determine whether they're going to go on a college track, a workforce track, or a military track. And when I said, what's the big challenge? She said, Beth, I have to teach them how to human. I said, what do you mean by that? Like, they don't show up with a pencil, and instead of asking to borrow one, they go, oh, I don't have a pencil, at the teacher. Or she brings employers in, and their first question is, in our first 6 months of work, how many, is it possible? Can we miss 6 days of work in the first 6 months? And she goes, no, the answer is 0. You can miss 0 days in the first, just basic things, because they haven't had it modeled to them. Because again, that collapsing of the middle class that happened in the wake of NAFTA, China joining the WTO, and then literally, if you take a map of where Purdue Pharma and others targeted the pill mills, it is a precise, almost map of where the problems are so bad now educationally.
Which brings us, I think, to politics, which is part of the story, media and politics, and sort of epistemology, right? How people come to know the world, how they come to know what's true, the institutions and people and frameworks that they parse reality through. And again, this is, I think we all know in a folk sense, people who pay attention to American culture and politics, that like a place like Urbana is going to be a Trump stronghold. This is bedrock truth, right?
Right.
And people have all kinds of different theories about what that is, but your reporting is so granular and I don't know, just there's such pathos to it. How do you understand it?
Well, I first came to understand it in my own family. I would visit, as I said, call it twice a year. And I, say in the early to mid-teens, I would go to my sister's house. She lived right down the street from my mom in the same little condo complex. And I go, hey, John, how are you doing? And he'd go, deplorable. And then my sister would have to go, we already talked about this, John. No politics. And she was sort of like, peacemaker. And then around 2017, my brother, who I was closest to in age and disposition, misses an invitation to my kid's high school play in which he plays Nathan Detroit in Guys and Dolls. And when I say, Tim, what's up? You missed Sasha's play. He's like, oh, I didn't see the note because I unfriended you on Facebook because of, quote, all the liberal crap you post, which are like fact-checked articles for the New York Times and Washington Post, some of which I wrote, and then we didn't talk for a couple years, which was stupid, but we didn't. And then this sort of pinnacle moment in my family occurs in 2020 as our mom, who's 93, is literally dying in hospice. And it happens to be the Saturday after the election in November. And they're counting the votes and recounting the votes in Georgia. And the hospice nurse goes, they're calling it for Biden. And my evangelical sister, Cookie, who was in the room with me, and had never said anything about politics before, let alone as our mother is dying, goes, you wait, it's fraudulent. He won't win. And I was just like, holy crap, what is happening here? I mean, we now know that 1 in 5 Americans is estranged from their families because of politics. We now know that polarization is a huge issue. But back then it sort of really rang my bell. And I thought with mom being gone and her being the glue, is there anything left of my family, my hometown, my country? So that's when I got the idea to go back. And then during those 2 years of homegoing, I realized my family's views weren't that extreme compared to others.
And why do you think it is?
Well, I think we have become so siloed and the media is so fragmented, and the decline of local news makes it possible for somebody to get all their news off of, national news, as I said, Fox and Newsmax in my family's case. And they don't know what's going on in their own neighborhood, but they know what they believe Trump is espousing. And I just think I was just astonished at how many people were far down into the conspiracy rabbit holes. Like our class reunion organizer, a hardware store owner,
High school boyfriend.
high school boyfriend, oh my God, who had been the most liberal person I ever knew. And he had gone from Bernie to Jill Stein and then to Trump and beyond Trump. When I asked him where he got his news, he said he spent 4 to 7 hours a day on a site out of Cyprus that is basically Russian propaganda. And he was the angriest person I've ever met in my life. He was a completely different person than who I had known 38 years prior.
I kind of go back. I've spent so much time thinking about this very question, right? I mean, it kind of is a central existential question, right? Like, if we're going to manage to save democracy, there's a bunch of people that are right now that have to be sort of, persuaded and recruited over to this coalition that are not in it right now, and I want to invite them over and do what's possible. And I think the thing that I keep coming back to in some ways, thinking about your story particularly, is that if you think about kind of like the unleashing this economic term, creative destruction, which is Joseph Schumpeter's term for the sort of way that capitalism works, right? I'm now in, I've lived long enough and long enough my career, middle age, to like watch it happen in person, right? Like, new startups that existed and then hired a bunch of people and laid everybody off in this span of 7 years, multiplied times 50, and industries
Much
that were going to be the
faster
future.
now.
Yes, right. Or industries that were going to be the future of everything, and then they're gone. And part of this is Schumpeter's insight that there's something profound about the dynamism of how capitalist economies can function in that way. But that the way that I've come to think about it is this sort of unleashing of kind of the turn in the 1980s of sort of neoliberalism, whatever you want to call it, Reaganism, of creative destruction, that you can kind of like divide the country into like the people that ended up on the creative side of that and the people that ended up on the destruction side. And that's kind of like geographically true. It's true in terms of like industries and college education, but like, there's Urbana and there's Palo Alto and Silicon Valley, right? And there's the metro area around Washington, D.C. And that doesn't mean that everyone included in those areas are doing great. They're not. But broadly, in this sort of geographic sense, it's like there's the places that got the creative part of creative destruction, and there's the places that got the destruction part of creative destruction. And if you're on the destruction side, I kind of understand why people feel furious and bitter and just kind of alienated and checked out and angry at the people who are at the creative side. I mean, I really,
Right.
it did hit home.
Yeah. Yeah. And we didn't do very much for the people left behind. We had this watered down anemic program called Trade Adjustment Assistance. That was
one of the all-time great failures in policy design, TAA.
Right. Only a third of the dislocated workers even took the government up on it because you had to go to school full time, and they couldn't foresee a world in which they could go to school full time and still pay their mortgage. And then there was no communication between the workforce and the jobs that were available and what people were going to study. So you'd have people in places like Martinsville, Virginia, which I wrote about in Factory Man, my first book about the aftermath of globalization. A little tiny town create 5 new paralegals when there was maybe one job in being a paralegal. And most of those folks who lost their factory jobs end up in customer service, fast food, earning half of what they once made and hardly any benefits. And they're angry about it. And then to put that next to sort of unfettered Silicon Valley and no real brakes on They don't have to follow the same rules that newspapers follow, for instance, on getting
Right.
both sides and following the facts. We know that lies spread on social media 6 times more than the truth. That's out of MIT. And there's a great story in the book about this 4th generation newspaper owner out of Iowa named Douglas
Yeah.
Burns. And Ro Khanna, who is a friend of his, takes him to meet this Facebook executive. And at the time, Doug and Ro are trying to talk this Facebook executive into funding this nonprofit Iowa newspaper foundation that will save Iowa's newspapers. And first they say no, and eventually they give him $150K just for his newspaper, but it's not enough, even though they remortgage the house and all this other stuff. And the family has to sell the papers at a huge loss. And what Doug says to the executive, and this is probably the most trenchant quote I've ever typed in my life, he says, when they're coming for you in your home behind a gated community and they're pulling you out of your home and the knife is going into your leg, you're going to think, maybe I could have stopped this. Basically saying your lack of care for the truth and your ability to put dollars above people is going to result in all of our ruin.
So media is one of the themes of the memoir, both because you are a reporter, a lifelong reporter, a member of the media. The people that some of the people you're really close to like hate the media, but they don't hate you, and you're trying to sort of figure out how to square that circle. Which is one of the more interesting parts of the book. And one of the things I feel like the fact that you've maintained these relationships and are not totally estranged makes it complicated for people to figure out how they feel about the media and feel about you.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, when my oldest, dearest friend, she's a lay minister who conducted my mom's funeral, says, the media is all lies. And I said, Joy, when I write a piece for the New York Times, it's fact checked by some Ivy League grad who works on it for 3 days. And, I told her about the last piece I had written where they tracked down a homeless, addicted person in a camp who no longer had a phone. And somehow they interviewed him for an hour. I said, it's like having a brain colonoscopy, these fact checks. And she said, who fact checks the fact checkers? And I said, Joy, facts are facts. Like, there are actual facts. We're sitting here in Betty's kitchen right now. This is a fact. And, she later apologized for that but again, it was kind of like the thing with the boyfriend where, to me, they were inexplicably angry about the press because they had been almost brainwashed into thinking we really are the enemy of the people. And I'm like, yeah, what reporter working their tail off 60 hours a week making $65,000 a year is the enemy of the people? No, they just want you to know what's going on and for your public officials to be accountable.
I mean, reactionary movements have targeted the media for a long time, and not just reactionary movements. There's been left-wing movements that have also targeted the media, but famously the Hitler and propagandists of the Nazi regime called it the Lügenpresse, the lying press, which is a word that I've actually heard that has been used at Trump rallies, which is unnerving. But what is your understanding of why the media has come to occupy? It's like the Democrats, the big city liberals, the media, and immigrants are the kind of Mount Rushmore of the kind of enemies, the people that have made things bad.
Well, I think the religious right started targeting that, right? Going back to moral majority and what Reagan did with the fairness doctrine, getting rid of that, which paved the way then for Rush Limbaugh and people like my brother-in-law who listened to him faithfully every single day, saying deplorable when his little sister-in-law asks how he's doing. And also the legit media, most of the legit media, by that I mean with fact checkers that give me a colonoscopy, they're behind a paywall, whereas you can get Fox just with your cable package. I mean, it's a brilliant business model, and then it doesn't hurt that your president is calling them the enemy of the people. I mean, reporters are being arrested now, including in Chicago for filming an ICE arrest. I'm afraid the slide is here.
Do you think it's fixable? So one of the ideas sometimes is like, well, if we've, there's sort of different theories about what would it take to realign the politics of a place like Urbana, or even take a place like Urbana that voted for Donald Trump by 75-25, a place that was 75 and make it 65, right? Like even that would be an enormous change and would sort of revolutionize in some ways politics, right? If every Urbana had margins that were, 30 as opposed to 50 points. And there's a few different ways people think about that. One is direct material improvement or investment. What if there was a new battery factory in Urbana and that was paid for by the federal government? And, this was one of the theories of the Biden administration, and they really
Yeah.
did. There was record amounts of factory construction. It goes basically off the chart. Often the money that flowed from the Biden policies would flow to places that were like Urbana. It tended to be more rural and more Republican than the median district. The other idea is that like education, reviving education, making college free for everyone, making it so someone like Silas can go. The other idea is like we need local media. We need to change the media environment. And I just think like, how do you think through those, having spent all this time talking to
Yeah.
people? And
Yeah. I mean, I think all the things you said, it just wasn't enough. Like there was this battery plant supposed to be built in New Albany, and it got stalled for many reasons, including they couldn't find the workforce to actually build the plant. And it's going to take a long time to get factory workers to get these new factories online. And I also think the Biden administration didn't do that good a job of telling the story of what they actually did. I think
Yeah.
there are some nonprofits that are doing some amazing work in the journalism space, like States Newsroom has a great outlet in Columbus, Ohio. They're killing it. They're doing a really good job, but most people in Urbana hadn't even heard of it. So, more outreach to the rural areas. In Roanoke, Virginia, where I live, we have an amazing nonprofit news site, no paywall. It's called Cardinal News. And they very strategically started by covering the rural areas, which they felt weren't getting enough attention, while they let the legacy media, the Roanoke Times, which has since shrunk into like a tenth of its former self, handle the city. And there's another nonprofit now. So, and then in terms of education, Silas, what I would always hear was, poor kids don't need to go to a 4-year college. And I would argue that fact because it basically saved my life. But they said, let the community colleges take care of it. And in Silas's case, he got 2 full scholarships, which he didn't really understand. He thought one would pay the tuition and the other would allow him things like to buy a car to get him there. But it didn't. It only went to tuition. And I think they're tinkering around the edges of that. And there's a new version of a Pell that is going to pay for supports on things like that. It just happened, actually. But to see him like drop out the first week because his car died and then his mom got in a wreck, and to see his family, chaos and trauma continue to drag him down to the point where he actually tries to commit suicide at one point. I mean, that's just a dark place. And if he had been able to be dropped off at a 4-year school like I was, and to get away from the chaos and the utility cutoff notices and all of that, and to experience like a calmer environment, that might have been really great for him.
How is Silas doing?
He's doing actually really good. It took him 5 cars and 4 full-time jobs to get through the 10-month welding program. The last job he was working in an O'Reilly auto parts store in Marysville, where he lives. And his mother relapsed. He was living with his mother and his younger siblings. His mother relapsed, lost custody. And then right after Silas graduated, he and his fiance, Max, ended up getting custody of the 2 teenagers. So they were 19-year-olds raising a 14 and 15-year-old, but they have their
Wow.
own space. They both have decent jobs. Silas got promoted to store manager. And, I think they're technically foster parents, so they get a little bit of money for that. And the kids are rising to it. And also Max has parents who did go to college. They're both educators. They're hugely supportive. And as I said earlier, when you have one piece of your family that can still support you, that can make all the difference.
What was it like to do that event in Urbana?
Well, I was a little nervous going in. My sister Cookie came, which was really surprising to me. I said, I'm speaking on Sunday, in a text, and I know it might be hard for you because she knew it was in the book. So I understand if you don't want to come, but all my family came, a bunch of my teachers. Silas was there. We were on a panel at the end. A bunch of my friends were there. Everybody was very supportive. I think mostly I was preaching to the choir. Mostly I was preaching to that 1 in 4 that didn't vote for Trump in the audience that were willing to hear. I mean, there's a lot of, I've heard, this was 2 days before the book came out. And a few days after the book came out, a friend of mine's 93-year-old mother-in-law went to her senior center book club. And some people were so ticked off that they were like, I'm taking this book back to the store. I don't want this book. And, and again, it's like it's news to them because this one person near the end of it says Urbana without, a healthy, factual news environment ends up being the country club and the ghetto, and neither side knows what the other one is up to. And then I come in and I challenge that, which I would tell my friends every time I was home. I was like, did you know the graduation rate? Did you know the mental health calls? And they were all just astonished.
Right.
And then a few of my friends who gave me interviews on the record, taking notes, recording with their permission, were pretty upset to find their views about conspiracy theories aired in a national book. And I never said I wasn't writing a national book. So
Right.
I guess it looks different when you see it in black and white.
Do you think it looks different because people have some sense that they sound conspiratorial, or they?
Yeah, maybe in the regular world, everybody just gives them the feedback that they're right. My one
Right,
friend,
yeah.
she's a Christian radio host. She was there after Ohio voters voted to enshrine the right to abortion in 2022. And she said, this is a very sad day for my community. So she clearly, in her circle, people think mostly the same way. And, that was just painful to have her. I mean, she really felt like I had thrown her under the bus by airing her beliefs. But I think we got to be responsible for our beliefs. We think this because of this. And I try to be open of, I made a mistake. I say I made a mistake. I correct the error. And they are just so certain that they're right. I don't know that their minds are willing to open to that. But she also is the person in the book that said, yeah, but how do we love beyond what we can't understand or agree with? So she's still trying, even in the message where she said, I threw her under the bus. She said, I wish you the best. I love you always, so I'm going to keep reaching out to her. I think she'll keep reaching out to me.
I do think that part of the book is it's so palpable and also so difficult, when you get to this human level, I mean, I have people that in my life that I have strong political disagreements with. And in some ways it's it's so much work that it's just always tempting to just stop working.
Right. Would I
Because
have
it's
gone down? Yes.
laborious, it's
Yes. And it hurts. It's painful.
it's painful.
And I would not have gone home every month for 2 years, on my own. I just wouldn't have done it. I mean, without my mom being there. And so one of the lessons I think is just showing up for each other, right? Every time I talk now, and I've been on tour for about 2 weeks, I get this Winston-Salem, North Carolina woman in the front row in the Q&A. She goes, help, how do I get through Thanksgiving? And I say, first of all, do go. You don't have to stay forever, but go. And, remember what it is. we're not just our politics. Remember who we are as people. Celebrate the things that you revere in your family, whether it's our feisty mom or who was hilarious and, playing guards, drinking beer, eating food, and fishing. I went fishing with my brother when we, have this
Yeah.
really difficult conversation, and now we're close again. So we got to keep throwing stuff on the wall and seeing what sticks because it's our family.
And I also wonder too, like how much I've been thinking a lot about pluralism and the concept of pluralism and the kind of original notion of pluralism, particularly at the sort of dawn of liberalism around basically religious pluralism and Christian faction, essentially, right? Like, which now seems ridiculous, right? Like now it's like of all the divisions in this country, the idea that like so and so is a Presbyterian, so and so is a Lutheran, and that's going to divide their families when they try to get married is like completely preposterous, and truly, I mean, I'm sure there are some people that care, but generally it's just not a fissure. And those doctrinal distinctions were the most salient fissures and the bloodiest for a long period of time, and particularly at the moment of the kind of philosophical construction about how do we all live with each other when some people are Calvinists and some are Anabaptists, right? And it's like, and a large part of it was a little bit of kind of quietism, right? Like where everyone's allowed to kind of do their things, and then we just don't talk about a lot of stuff, like whether I think you're going to hell.
Talk about sex or politics, right?
Exactly,
you
or
should
religion.
Only get your
often
newspaper, your name of the newspaper when you got married and when you died.
Right. And so I do wonder sometimes. I don't know. I'm sort of thinking out loud here, so I'm not like committed to this view, but I do wonder whether a little bit of quietism on that front maybe is necessary again for like political pluralism in community building, where like. And I know I can hear people in my head saying, well, if someone says something bigoted or nasty in front of you, like, you got to say something. And I generally agree with that. But all of this stuff is on a sliding spectrum, right? So bigoted and nasty might require a response, but like, I'm not getting the vaccine, or Joe Biden's son was corrupt. There's a whole bunch of things of like, do you let him go? Do you not? Do we create norms now where we don't talk about politics so that we could like preserve community, because in the end that community is going to be the bulwark against something even darker than what we have now? I don't know.
That's the question of our times, Chris. It really is. I think it's a sliding scale. So when my sister says my kids are going to go to hell because they're queer, I can't employ those rural urban lessons, those divide bridging lessons that I've called all over the country interviewing experts about, because I get so upset and my face turns red. And I think of Mr. Rogers saying, use your words, Beth. Like I say, if we're going to maintain a relationship, we can't talk about this because it got really ugly fast. But with my brother, for instance, he asks about my non-binary child. And he says, well, does he still date girls? And he said it in such a tone that was curious. It wasn't mean.
Yeah, right. Totally. Yes.
He just wants to know. And so by instinct, we mirror that same tone back. And I said, well, yeah, they are dating a young woman now. And I sometimes mess up the pronouns too. And if you can be vulnerable in that moment, like if I could have said to my sister Cookie, I did the best I could with what I knew at the time, what would you have done? I don't know if that would have opened a little crack of empathy, but we need to start opening those cracks.
It is interesting that while Silas faces some bigotry or just it being trans, that doesn't seem like the primary challenge at all that Silas is facing. And in fact, the people in his inner circle generally seem to be pretty chill about the whole thing.
Most people, I would guess, that he works with don't even know he's trans because he totally passes.
Right, exactly.
And even his mother came around, who was very conservative and didn't like that he was gay before they knew the concept of trans. Even now she will say, after living with him for so long, I know that it's not a choice. And God she now thinks God gave him to her so she wouldn't be so discriminatory.
Do you think you'll keep going back now that the book is done?
Man, you asked a hard question, Chris Hayes. I will go back. I'm not going to go back once a month. A lot of times I would go back and I would rent an Airbnb for a week. And by the end of day 4, I'm like, I got to get home to my husband and my dog and my friends who think exactly like I do.
It's much more enjoyable.
Oh, I would just be so tired. I would come home and
Yeah.
I would type up my notes and I would just like from bed for 3 days and just have to chill.
To end on a hopeful note, I do think the sort of beacons of hope and light and the people that are working so hard in Urbana were really inspiring to me. The truancy officer,
Yeah.
you mentioned the band leader, like, and I don't know, like, and I don't know what those people's, I don't know what anyone's politics are. I do know like decency when I see it. And um, I did think that there's still so much decency in so many places that have
Absolutely.
a politics that have gotten corroded and indecent, and a media environment that's indecent, and a bunch of leadership messages that are indecent. But I do think that there's so much decency that comes out of this book.
Right. That doesn't get the attention, because the loud, shrill things gets all the attention. So, and that's part of what we're missing from a lack of newspapers is the empathy building stories that told people who they were and who you were, warts and
Yeah.
all. And I just I want people to see that decency. I'm not sure exactly how they see it when they're just on their devices, but I hope this book is a call for us to be in community with one another again.
Beth Macy is the author of numerous books, and her latest is called Paper Girl, a memoir of home and family in a fractured America. Beth, that was great. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Chris. I enjoyed it.